I want you to think about the last time you went to the hardware store, or looked at the sticker price on a new truck, or even just bought a six-pack of soda. You probably noticed the price ticked up. Maybe you blamed inflation. Maybe you blamed the supply chain. But I want you to imagine waking up one morning to realize that a material so ordinary, so fundamental to modern life that you never think about it, has suddenly become a luxury good. I'm not talking about gold or diamonds. I'm talking about aluminum. It didn't disappear because of a natural disaster. It didn't run out because of a strike. It vanished and became prohibitively expensive because of a signature on a piece of paper in Washington. What we are dealing with here is one of the most significant yet underreported shifts in the global economic order. On the surface, this is a story about tariffs, taxes on imports, but if you dig deeper past the headlines about protecting American industry, you find a much more alarming reality. We are witnessing a breakdown in the legal and economic trust that has held the Western alliance together for decades. We are seeing what happens when a country tries to use national security laws to rewrite the laws of supply and demand, only to find out that the market hits back harder. In this video, we are going to walk through exactly how the United States managed to alienate its closest economic ally, Canada, and send them straight into the arms of Europe. We're going to look at the legal mechanisms used to justify this, specifically Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, and why using it backfired spectacularly. And most importantly, I'm going to show you how this high-level political strategy is quietly acting as a direct tax on your paycheck, your housing costs, and your job security. I'm Daniel Kershaw, an independent legal and political journalist. I don't work for any party, and I don't spin for any campaign. I just follow the facts, the court filings, and the law. And there is one specific detail in how these contracts were rewritten, a risk premium that suppliers started charging American companies that almost nobody is talking about. It's a detail that essentially proves the U.S. is now considered a risky investment. We'll get to that in a few minutes, and when you see it, you'll understand why your cost of living isn't going down anytime soon. But first, I have to ask, if a policy is designed to project American strength but ends up making every single thing you buy more expensive while our allies walk away, where does the line between protection and self-sabotage actually lie? Let's start with the context that most cable news segments gloss over. To understand why prices exploded, you have to understand the mechanism that triggered it. The United States imposed steep tariffs on imported aluminum. Now, tariffs are nothing new, but the justification used here was specific: national security. Under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the President has the authority to restrict imports if they threaten the security of the United States. The argument is intuitive. If we need aluminum to build fighter jets, tanks, and critical infrastructure, we cannot be dependent on foreign nations. If a war breaks out, we need our own smelters. That sounds logical on paper, but when you look at the industrial reality, the logic collapses. The United States simply does not produce enough aluminum to meet its own needs. We haven't for a long time. This isn't a conspiracy. It's geology and economics. Smelting aluminum requires massive amounts of cheap electricity. For decades, the American market survived and thrived because we had a silent partner, Canada. Canada has abundant hydroelectric power. They have massive smelting capacity. For generations, aluminum flowed south across the border, factories in the Midwest stayed fed, and prices for you, the consumer, stayed stable. It was a seamless, integrated system. Then came the tariffs. The policy decision effectively rewrote the economics of buying metal from our closest ally. Suddenly, American buyers, manufacturers, construction firms, packaging companies faced a brutal choice. They could pay dramatically higher prices to import the metal they needed, or they could try to wait it out. And that's exactly what they did. Firms act rationally. Facing uncertainty, they delayed orders. They stopped buying. They turned to their existing stockpiles, the reserves they keep for a rainy day. For a few months, this masked the problem. The economy looked fine because companies were burning through their savings, essentially. But stockpiles are not a solution. They are a buffer, and buffers run out. When those reserves finally hit zero, reality didn't just knock on the door, it kicked it down. And what happened next in the global market is something that should worry anyone who cares about the stability of the American economy. This is where the story gets interesting and, frankly, a little frightening for anyone who assumes the U.S. is the center of the economic universe. There is a fundamental rule in capitalism: markets do not reward loyalty, they reward predictability. When you are a supplier in Canada and you look south at the United States, what do you see? You see tariffs that can double overnight via a tweet or a sudden executive order. You see contracts that lose money the moment they are signed. You see political chaos layered on top of industrial policy. You do not dig in out of friendship. You pivot. Canada didn't wake up wanting to punish the United States. This wasn't malice, it was math. While Washington was consumed by political drama and talking points about winning, Canadian producers were looking at a map, and they saw Europe. Europe was facing its own supply concerns. They were eager to diversify away from dependence on Chinese metals. So the Europeans offered something the United States had stopped offering: stability. They offered tariff-free access. They offered clear contracts. They offered a regulatory environment that didn't change based on the news cycle. So the ships turned. This is the part that is legally and logistically fascinating. Trade partners started rerouting physical shipments. They renegotiated long-term contracts. They built new relationships that explicitly excluded the United States. While American buyers were waiting for the negotiating tactic to work, the metal they needed was being sold to Germany, to France, to Italy. And here is that detail I mentioned in the beginning, the one that explains why your costs are rising. When American companies finally realized they couldn't wait any longer and tried to buy aluminum, they found a new landscape. Suppliers understood that holding aluminum inside the U.S. or selling to the U.S. was now a gamble. Tariffs might rise again, exemptions might vanish. So producers began pricing that uncertainty directly into their contracts. New surcharges emerged. These weren't just covering the cost of the metal, they were risk premiums. Effectively, suppliers said, if we are going to do business in the volatile American market, you, the American buyer, are going to pay for the insurance. I want to pause here for a second. If you're listening to this and feeling a bit overwhelmed by talk of smelters and risk premiums, I don't blame you. Most people have enough to worry about with their mortgage and their kids' tuition without worrying about global trade logistics. But this is why it matters. That risk premium didn't stay in the corporate boardroom. It got passed down. It's in the price of the canned soup you bought for dinner. It's in the construction quote for your local school renovations. You are paying the insurance premium for the government's unpredictability. And if you think this is just a temporary blip, that once the tariffs are tweaked, everything goes back to normal, you need to hear what happened next. Because in the world of global logistics, some doors, once closed, act like they are welded shut. From a legal perspective, this is deeply troubling. We are watching the concept of private governance take over where public policy failed. These surcharges and premiums were not debated on the floor of Congress. No representative voted on them. You didn't vote on them. They were imposed contract by contract, quietly, legally, and with enormous impact. This is what happens when the executive branch uses broad powers like Section 232 to interfere with complex markets without a clear exit strategy. The market creates its own laws, in the form of higher prices, to protect itself. Economists have a word for what is happening now: hysteresis. It means that the effects of a shock persist even after the shock is removed. Think about it. Canadian and European companies have now invested billions in new logistics. They've signed new multi-year contracts. They've aligned their regulatory standards. Those investments create inertia. Even if the U.S. dropped every tariff tomorrow, why would a Canadian supplier rush back to an abusive relationship when they have a stable marriage with Europe? They wouldn't. They have learned that relying too heavily on the American market leaves them exposed to political whiplash. Now, let's look at who pays for this. When aluminum in the U.S. becomes structurally more expensive than in the rest of the world, American manufacturers are immediately at a disadvantage. If you are making Ford trucks in Michigan, and your aluminum costs 20% more than your competitor making trucks in Germany or Japan, you have two choices: eat the cost and lose profit, which leads to layoffs, or raise prices and lose customers, which also leads to layoffs. This is how a trade policy aimed at protection quietly turns into a regressive tax on American workers. It squeezes margins. Squeezed margins mean wages stagnate. It means capital investments get delayed. If you work in construction, manufacturing, or even retail, this is the invisible hand reaching into your pocket. You might see a headline saying economy adds jobs, but if your cost of living is rising faster than your wage because of these structural input costs, you're getting poorer. If you are a renter and construction costs are up because materials are expensive, your rent goes up. The landlord blames the market blames the supply chain, and the supply chain points back to the policy. But aluminum is just the opening chapter. What's truly alarming is that this playbook, this idea that we can bully allies into submission without economic consequences, is being looked at for other, even more critical sectors, and that brings us to the nightmare scenario. When you step back and look at the timeline, the aluminum crisis stops being a story about one metal. It starts looking like a warning flare for the entire U.S. economy. We are seeing a shift in how the world views the United States. For 70 years, the assumption was that access to the American consumer was the golden ticket. Countries would put up with almost anything to sell to us. That assumption is eroding. European officials have started using a new phrase: economic security. When they say that, they aren't just talking about protecting themselves from Russia or China. They are talking about protecting themselves from us, from American volatility. If aluminum can be rerouted this quickly, what about steel? What about the lithium batteries that will power the next generation of cars? What about the critical minerals needed for our phones and computers? Once a country is perceived as politically volatile, suppliers hedge. They reduce exposure. This is the big idea I want you to grasp. Isolation is expensive. If the United States becomes an island where everything costs more to make, companies will simply move their factories elsewhere. They won't leave because they hate America. They will leave because the spreadsheet tells them they have to. Capital moves. It flows instantly across borders. Labor, you, me, the workers in the Midwest, we don't get that option. We are stuck here paying the higher prices. There is a deep irony here. The rhetoric surrounding these tariffs was all about independence and self-sufficiency, but the result was a clearer picture of our interdependence. We didn't become self-sufficient in aluminum. We just became dependent on a smaller, more expensive pool of supply. We cannot declare supply chains into existence with a signature. You cannot threaten your way into resilience. Rebuilding an industrial base requires cheap energy, massive infrastructure investment, and years of planning, not a sudden shock therapy that scares away your partners. From a constitutional and legal standpoint, this sets a dangerous precedent. It reinforces the idea that the president can use national security as a catch-all excuse to manipulate the economy, bypassing Congress. This erodes the checks and balances that are supposed to provide stability, and as we've seen, when stability goes, prices go up. So, let's recap what we've uncovered today. First, we saw how a policy based on Section 232, ostensibly for national security, failed to account for the basic reality that the U.S. cannot feed its own industrial base. Second, we saw how markets reacted not with loyalty but with rationality. Canada and Europe effectively bypassed the U.S., creating a new supply chain that left us out in the cold. And third, we saw how the costs of this political theater were passed directly down to you in the form of risk premiums and higher costs of living. At its core, this case is about one uncomfortable truth. In a globalized economy, you cannot be both a chaos agent and a safe harbor. When leaders confuse leverage with strength and treat interconnected supply chains as if they were disposable toys, the system breaks. And when it breaks, the pieces fall on the people with the least protection, the workers and the consumers. I want to leave you with this question to think about. As we head into an era where economic warfare becomes the norm, are you willing to pay the price? If making America strong means your rent is higher, your car is more expensive, and your job is less secure because our allies have decided to trade around us, is that a price you voted for? If you want to understand how these high-level legal and political decisions are actually shaping your daily reality beyond the shouting matches on cable news, make sure you're subscribed. We are going to keep tracking these supply chain shifts and the court rulings that enable them. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you noticed unexplained price hikes in your line of work? Let's talk about it. I'm Daniel Kershaw. I follow the law and the facts wherever they lead. Thanks for watching.